So, so as you know, like we've been trying for the past few months to get a meeting with the FAA. We were finally able to make that happen. We sat down earlier this week with members of the FAA's Denver office, ATC, as well as some representatives from the local flight schools. We discussed the VFR flight paths that have been developed. Both ATC and the flight schools were amenable to this idea. One thing that they did say, however, is that instead of having a numerous ingress and egress routes up to the northern training areas, where my understanding is that's 90% of the flights. One of the flight schools said that's roughly 90% of their flights is up to the north. We also discussed the south, which I'll get to in just a little bit. To avoid confusion with the pilots and to deconflict the ingress and egress routes, they suggested that we condense the ingress and egress routes down to just a few per runway configuration. One thing that they did mention was, we looked at the noise sensitive area map that we got from the communities, and it doesn't leave a whole lot of areas, for the aircraft to go up, which they were a little disappointed with. However, they do think that they can stay over the roads. Secondly, we discussed the option of creating an additional VFR training area that would perhaps provide a better route for the aircraft to travel to, so they wouldn't have to transit over noise sensitive areas. One of the unfortunate things with the geography and the location of Rocky Mountain Metro is not only Denver's Class Bravo airspace out to the east, but the mountain range out to the west. So one of the areas that we had been looking at was there's a lot of non-noise sensitive land out to the west of the airfield. Unfortunately, a lot of that land prior to the mountain range is Rocky Mountain Metro's Class Delta airspace, which is ATC, which is basically the tower, for those that aren't familiar. That is the tower at Rocky Mountain. That's the airspace that they control. So that's their airspace. You wouldn't be able to stick a VFR training area inside ATC's Class Delta airspace. So that leaves us with just a little bit of room outside of that Class Delta between the Delta and the mountain range. And all of the flight schools said that the weather phenomenon and wind coming off of the mountain ranges would make a VFR training area out to the west outside of the Class Delta basically unusable for most of the year. So they recommended that we reach out to the Colorado Pilots Association airspace chair, which I have done, asking him to coordinate with myself and the flight schools and look into the possibility of developing additional VFR flight areas, which may help disperse some of the traffic and may provide a better opportunity for direct flight paths to that VFR training area that don't overfly noise sensitive areas. So one thing that they can do, but they didn't seem too thrilled about, is having an ingress and egress route that follows the same path but is deconflicted by altitude. So they don't like that idea, especially with the majority of the flights being training flights with student pilots. So we had to deconflict those ingress and egress routes laterally. So it'll be up to ATC to determine which routes they find are viable and which they want to reduce it down to, and that goes for the routes down to the south as well.
I mean, you said we can't put a training ground in an area that no one's using because it's too close to the tower. Like, I want to know exactly the citation and rule that's behind that, because what you're saying, that doesn't make any sense. Like, there's no one there, there's no one using it, it's over a non-noise sensitive area, it's closer to the airport, people don't have to use as much gas. So I just want to understand like the actual legal theory that you're proposing there.
Absolutely. I'll send you the publication and the citation for that.
And I think we've heard tonight from several people who said you just be moving the noise from one place to another, and we don't feel like that's okay. And obviously there's two approaches here. One is to try to put the noise over a spot that's less impactful on people, although there's no spot that's not impactful on somebody. Or the other option, obviously, is to disperse things more widely so that nobody gets lots of traffic and everybody gets a little. Is part of your work consider any of those alternatives, or are you just really focused currently on just these routes?
Well, so that was our charge, was to develop these VFR routes. So obviously, when you develop a system that has preferred VFR routing, you are necessarily going to concentrate the aircraft on those routes. When there are no routes, when there is no standard, those flights get dispersed. So our job was to come up with these VFR routes to use the noise sensitive area map to try and avoid the noise sensitive areas as best we could. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of options left transiting up to the north with the noise sensitive area map that we have. So we did our best to maintain those VFR routes over over large highways, and then for the areas where we couldn't keep them over the roads, we tried to take them as far away from the airport so they could climb as high as they could before turning direct to the VFR training areas. The main area that we were looking at was out to the west. That was our hope, because that, obviously, when you look at the noise sensitive area map, that is the area that provides the best route to maintain a flight path over non-noise sensitive areas. So we're still hoping that maybe there's, you know, some insight that can be provided by the Colorado Pilots Association. So they are the ones that typically handle the VFR training area. So when we discuss this with the FAA has no, basically they are not the approval or denying authority to create a VFR training area. So a VFR training area, they're hardly ever depicted. Sometimes they're depicted on VFR sectionals, other times not, but it's basically a group, you know, of pilots that get together and decide, try and find an area where there isn't a lot of flight traffic, and set up a training area where pilots can go unencumbered and fly. So like I said, we were hoping to put one out to the west. Unfortunately, some of the pilots that were in the meeting said that that area is not going to be usable the majority of the time due to the winds coming off the mountain. So I'm not an expert in the piloting of aircraft, so I was leaning on them for that part of it. But I did want to consult with the Colorado Pilots Association. They're the ones that develop the VFR training areas.
Well, but I mean, so the community had no say over them establishing it over a neighborhood? And so I guess I don't understand what you're saying. Like, they would never move it over another area, but they put it over your area and didn't ask you. I don't quite get
Well,
it.
so I'm saying in this particular instance, because the reason that we're looking for an additional VFR training area is to reduce noise impacts. So I wouldn't imagine that they would, you know, stick another one right over top of a neighborhood. When they developed those, I wasn't around for that. So I'm not sure what the, you know, what the theory was behind that. But, you know, really they can make VFR training areas, you know, wherever they want. As long as there isn't any traffic, it doesn't affect traffic into Rocky Mountain, or it doesn't affect traffic into Denver.
I wanted to follow up on that question. Are VFR training areas actually official airspace, or is it
No,
kind of non-official
typically no.
airspace? Yeah, so it's not an official airspace
No.
designation. It's just a spot that people go.
Yes.
Because it has certain characteristics. It's not actually been
Correct.
designated by anybody as there, or anything like that.
Correct.
Mr. Miller, do we know, does the ATC here at RMMA, do they provide any regular, semi-regular briefings to the flight schools?
No, they have a once a year, I forget the acronym they call it, but kind of a once a year get together with airport attendants to discuss safety issues on the airfield.
As you're describing this, you're describing it that the new pathways would be along the roadway, like 287. But one of the things that we heard from people in public testimony is that the new pathways would move over their houses and over new neighborhoods. So does I guess I want to get a sense from you around the new pathways that you are squeezing out, because I know it's tight. But does it move it to another neighborhood, or is it over the roadway?
So in terms of moving it, we didn't have any flight track data provided to us. So what we were working with was a blank slate and this noise sensitive area. So for the neighborhoods that you're talking about, those we tried to give ATC and the roundtable the largest option of VFR flight paths to pick from. So when we developed some of the routes, we took them up Route 36. I'm not exactly sure I think it's 36 that goes up to the northwest. We took them up 36, tried to get them to stay along that road as long as they could before turning direct to the training areas. I think those are the ones that people are referring to that might fly over neighborhoods, or that do fly over neighborhoods. Our hope was that they'd be at an altitude where they would provide less of a noise impact to those neighborhoods, because one of the things that was mentioned is that there's a lot of glider traffic to the west of the power plant in Boulder. So we tried to keep that flight path along 36 and then provide a route that was east of the power plant in Boulder up to the northern training areas. In addition to our other routes that tried to maintain the route completely over a road up to the northern training areas.
So your feeling, Jason, is that as the flight path goes over 36, there's neighborhoods on either side of those, that's what it's gonna hit. Is that what your feeling is?
So yes, one of those paths will cross over noise sensitive areas. Yes.